Hello friends, I am Mrs. Meenakshi Shrigandhi, Assistant Professor from Walchand Institute of Technology, Solapur. In today's discussion, we are going to focus on the topic constructors and its types. Learning outcome: at the end of this session, students will be able to understand the definition and different types of constructors. Let's see the definition of constructors. Constructors are special member function whose task is to initialize the objects of its class. These are called special because its name is the same as the class name. Let's see the declaration of constructor. Here in the example, the class integer is having the data members m and n in the private section of the class, whereas in the public section, a member function has been declared whose name is same as the class name. This is called as a constructor. Now, the constructor is a non-inline constructor in this case, whose definition is outside the class. The role of this constructor is to assign the data members m and n to 0. Now, let's focus on how to invoke a constructor. Now, a constructor is invoked whenever an object of its associated class is created. These are called constructors because it constructs the values of the data members of the class. Now in this example, when the object of the class has been created, then the constructor is invoked automatically. Then automatically the data members m and n are initialized to 0 for the object A. Let's see the characteristics of constructors. The first characteristic is they are declared in the public section of the class. This is shown in the example. Here, a constructor with name integer has been declared in the public section of the class integer. The second characteristic is they are automatically invoked when the objects are created. In the example, you can see the objects, there are three objects A, B and C. When these are created, then the constructor is invoked for 3 times. And it assigns the data members m and n to 0 for the objects A, B and C. The third characteristic is they do not have return types, not even void, and that's why they do not return values. This is shown in the example. Here the constructor integer is not having any return type. The fourth characteristic is they cannot be inherited, though a derived class can call a base class constructor. The fifth characteristic is they can have a default arguments. What are the advantages of constructors? Pause the video for some time and note down the answer. Advantages of constructor. The very first advantage is that a constructor eliminates placing the default values. The second advantage is that the constructor eliminates calling the member function using the normal method implicitly. Let's focus on an example. Here, a class integer has been declared having data members m and n in the private section of the class, and a normal member function, that is initialize, has been declared in the public section of the class. In main, 100 objects had been created, the objects A1 to A100. These are the objects for the class integer. Now the role of the member function is used to initialize the data members m and n to 0. Now when the objects are created, what we are doing is we are calling this member function separately with each object. What you can see that it is infeasible to call a single member function 100 times, which increases the program length. This infeasibility can be overcome by using constructor, where declaration of the objects can invoke the function 100 times. So the main advantage of constructor is that it eliminates the need of function calls. Let's see the types of constructor. The first type is the default constructor. A constructor that accepts no parameter is called as the default constructor. Let's see an example for default constructor. Here is a class A having the data members m and n in the private section of the class, and in the public section, a constructor A has been declared. As you can see, the constructor is having no parameters. Such a constructor with no parameter is called as a default constructor. The Constructor is a non-inline constructor whose definition is outside the class. The role of the constructor is used to initialize the data members m and n to 0. Now, when in main we are creating the object A for the class A, then this constructor, default constructor, is invoked automatically. Then it assigns the data members m and n to 0 for the object A. The second constructor is the parameterized constructor. The constructors that can take arguments are called as parameterized constructors. Let's see an example to understand the difference between a default constructor and a parameterized constructor. Now, in the previous case, we have considered the default constructor where it was initializing all the objects to 0 values. But it can happen that a user wants a different initialization other than 0. At that time, when the user wants different initialization to different objects, that time a parameterized constructor is used. So let's focus on an example which clarifies the difference between a default constructor and a parameterized constructor. Here is a class A having the data members m and n in the private section of the class, and in the public section a constructor A has been declared. As you can see, the constructor accepts two parameters x and y whose values are assigned to the data members m and n. Now, when in main we are creating the object, now this time the parameterized constructor is not invoked. This is not sufficient to invoke a parameterized constructor. So this statement doesn't work. So when we are creating the object, that time we need to pass the parameters to invoke a parameterized constructor. So in the second case, when the object B has been created, that time we are passing the parameters 10 and 20. That time the parameterized constructor is invoked and it takes the values 10 and 20 and it assigns the data members m equal to 10 and n equal to 20 for the object B. Similarly, when the object C has been created, the parameters 30 and 40 are passed, then it assigns the value 30 to the data member M and 40 to the data member N for the object C. The third type of the constructor is the do-nothing constructor. This constructor doesn't have any arguments and it contains the empty body and it does not do anything. It is used to create objects without initial values. So the do-nothing constructors are usually used to skip the initialization. So to understand more on do-nothing constructor, let's take an example. Here in class A, the data members m and n are declared under the private section of the class, and under the public section there are two constructors, a do-nothing constructor and a parameterized constructor. As you can see, a do-nothing constructor is having no arguments and an empty body, there is no definition. Whereas a parameterized constructor is having two parameters x and y whose values are assigned to the data members m and n. Now, when the object A1 has been created in the main function, then it is taking parameters 3 and 4. Then the parameterized constructor is invoked. Then it assigns the value 3 and 4 to the data members m and n for the object A1. Whereas when the object A2 has been created, it takes the values 5 and 6 and it assigns the values to m and n for the object A2. So for both the times, when the A1 and A2 objects are been created, that time the parameterized constructors are invoked. But when the object A3 has been created, that time the do-nothing constructor is invoked. As you can see, when a do-nothing constructor is invoked, there is no initialization. Now, one thing a user, a programmer has to keep in mind that a do-nothing constructor and a default constructor cannot exist in a program at the same time. Here the programmer has to decide whether he wants some initialization or doesn't want any initialization. But both cannot exist in a program at the same time. The last type of the constructor is the copy constructor. This constructor is used to declare and initialize an object from another object. name suggests, here we copy the values of one object into another object of the same class. To understand more on copy constructor, let's take an example. A class A has been declared having data members M and N in the private section of the class, and in the public section there are three constructors, a parameterized constructor and a copy constructor. Now when in main we are creating the object A1, then the parameterized constructor is invoked, which takes the values 10 and 20 and it assigns them to M and N. When the object A2 has been created, at the same time, as you can see, A1 is passed as a parameter. So this is taken as a reference and element to element of the object A1 is copied to object A2. When object A3 has been created, then the copy constructor is invoked again, taking the reference of the object A1. Now again the element to element of object A1 is copied to element of object A3. Now both this declaration will invoke the copy constructor. So both are used to invoke the copy constructor. So copy constructors are usually used when we want to assign some values from another object to another object. These are my references. With this, we have come to an end of the session. Thank you.